Hello YouTube land, hello Pero. This is again metaphysics, specifically the metaphysics of truth. Now there's a lot of assumptions and comments in your videos, and a few comments that you've posted to me about truth that I want to really try to break down your intuitions on this, because I think what you're trying to say leads to contradiction. So where shall we begin? I'm gonna hopefully talk about the distinction a priori, a posteriori, with the distinction necessary, contingent, and impossible. I'm gonna try to tie in the relations between those two. Now, I've got kind of two theses here. Firstly, necessarily there are a priori statements. Secondly, to suppose a priori statement isn't to suppose that there's a transcendental sort of Platonic heaven. So the first part, necessarily there are a priori statements, is pretty easy to demonstrate. Obviously, if the only two truth conditionals of a proposition, if we either accept the proposition, which is there are a priori statements, so necessarily there are a priori statements, or we accept its negation. So there are not a priori statements, would be the negation. Now, the negation seems to run into logical difficulties, as it would seem that accepting the negation is an a priori statement in itself, and by that it's a necessary a priori statement. But it's necessarily false, because if there were a necessary a priori statement about the non-existence of necessary a priori statements, it'll be a contradiction. So we simply can't rule out a priori statements. It's self-fulfilling by mere linguistic definition that there are a priori statements. So let's talk a bit about the distinctions that we can have. Well, firstly, we can have the strongest sort of form of truth, which is something that's necessary and a priori. To say that something's necessary is to say that any possible arrangement of objects, any possible worlds that we could care to dream up that obey the same logical structures as ours, or any way in which our world could be, is a possible world. So a necessary statement is something that's true in all possible worlds at all possible times. It's necessarily true. For you, Pero, and for Berkeley, the truth, an a priori necessary truth that you hold, is that to exist is to perceive or to be perceived, and you share that with Berkeley. Another a priori necessary analytic truth would be that bachelors are unmarried men. There doesn't seem to be much problem in this. It's a priori truths are almost, by definition, what we consider true in our ontology. Then there are the contingent truths, merely possible truths. Two types. Firstly, contingent things that are true, i.e. Obama is the President of America. Second, contingent things that are false. There is a 5-year-old child as President of America. It's not impossible, if we've got a vast array of possible worlds, that in one of those possible worlds a child would be President of the United States, but it doesn't obtain of the actual world. And then obviously the last kind of thing that we have is an impossibility. An impossible thing is where the rules of logic apply, but leads to contradiction. An impossible statement would be there are no a priori truths. It's logically inconsistent. But so would a round square, or a and not a, anything like that. So that's impossible worlds. Lastly, we can have a necessary truth that's not of the same form. We can have a necessary a posteriori truth. We could figure out that the morning star is the evening star. Now, a thing is necessarily itself, so the morning star is necessarily the evening star but it wasn't something that we could deduce through reason and reason alone. Okay, so I think I've covered the first bit. We do need a priori truths because we can't rule them out. There's no evidence, empirical observation that you could give me to rule out a priori truths. And the negation of such a statement is an a priori truth in itself. So, the second thing, do we need a Platonic heaven? I don't think so. I don't see why we'd need a Platonic heaven to say that bachelors or unmarried men to exist is to X. Personally, I'd say to exist is to have a causal property of some description, or to be involved in the correct way causally with the rest of the universe. That would be my definition of existence. Yours would be different. But we both hold that these things are necessary. So we can't escape the possibility of a priori truths, and it wouldn't seem like there's anything that's weird about me saying that if you exist, you've got properties. That doesn't invoke some sort of Platonic heaven. So I don't know where that I'm not saying when we discuss a priori truths and things like that. I mean, at the bare minimum, what we could be doing is discussing logic and the philosophy of language. That's one sort of light to take in it, but we have to be able to say something about the nature of reality for the same reasons. It's you know how Kant obviously supposes the phenomenal world and the noumenal world, and he says we can't make any statements about the noumenal, it's beyond the reach of our phenomenological experience, and that argument's obviously fake because he's saying something about the noumenal world, and it seems that that's almost what you're doing. I'm not saying that a priori truths sort of transcend our ideological, our cultural, or sort of evolutionary biases, but I'm saying necessarily we have to be able to say something about reality, because either that or we accept its negation, which is necessarily we can't say something about reality, which seems to be saying something about reality. So we can say things about reality, and there are a priori truths, and we don't need to transcend our human limitations, our evolutionary, biological or social biases in order to say anything like that. There doesn't need to be any sort of spooky, weird stuff going on in the background. It's just logical. It's just impossible for it not to be the case. And be this a way in which logic works, be it a way in which language works, or be it a way indeed of the way that reality works. But it seems to me we can't rule out the possibility of a priori statements, and we have to be able to talk about reality. Now, Piero, if you're unhappy with my defense of there's not a Platonic heaven, I think what you need to do first is to show what assumption a priori statements and Platonic heaven have in common, and why the assumptions that those things are grounded on are false, and how your solution to that avoids the problem, i.e. your criticism doesn't fall back on the thing that you tried to reject. So I think I've made my case. I prefer video responses to comments. Obviously hope to hear from Piero soon, but hope to hear from a few other people, see what everyone else has to say on the subject. Peace.